A flight to equality. Alice Johnson was no stranger to airports, but she had always viewed them as gateways to possibilities. Doors that opened to diplomacy, change, and hope. Dressed impeccably in a tailored navy blue suit, her UN badge glinting against her lapel, Alice exuded confidence. Today was a pivotal day in her career, one she had prepared for meticulously. She was en route to deliver a keynote speech at a United Nations summit addressing systemic racism and discrimination worldwide. The airport was buzzing with activity, a microcosm of humanity in transit. Families hugged their goodbyes, business travelers hurried to gates, and the occasional backpacker paused to marvel at the massive departure screens. Alice walked briskly, her diplomatic briefcase in hand, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. When she reached the passport control desk, she was greeted by a middle-aged officer who appeared indifferent to the sea of faces before him. Alice handed over her diplomatic passport, embossed with the official UN seal. "Good morning," she said with a professional smile. The officer glanced at the document, then at Alice, his eyes narrowing slightly. He flipped through the pages, scrutinizing the stamps and seals. "One moment," he muttered, signaling to a junior colleague. Alice felt the shift in energy instantly. The junior officer leaned in, whispered something, and both men began scrutinizing her passport more closely. She stood still, her smile faltering, but her composure intact. "Is there a problem?" she asked calmly. The senior officer looked up, his expression now a mixture of skepticism and authority. "This passport doesn't look authentic," he said, his tone colder than before. Alice's heart skipped a beat, but she remained composed. "I assure you, it's valid. I am a UN diplomat, and all my documentation is in order. If necessary, you can contact the UN office to confirm." Her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officer's frown deepened as he exchanged glances with his colleague. Then, to her shock, he pulled out a pair of scissors. "This is standard procedure for suspected fraudulent documents," he said curtly. Before Alice could protest, he cut a corner off her passport, rendering it invalid. Gasps rippled through the surrounding passengers, some of whom began recording the incident on their phones. "This is outrageous," Alice exclaimed, her voice rising. "You've destroyed an official document without cause. Call your supervisor immediately." "Lower your voice, ma'am," the officer said, his tone laced with condescension. "Step aside." Alice's heart pounded as she was escorted to a small interrogation room, flanked by uniformed officers. Her belongings, including her phone, were confiscated and sealed in a plastic bag. Sitting alone in the sterile room, she tried to steady her breathing, her mind racing. This was more than a misunderstanding. It was a blatant act of prejudice. Meanwhile, outside the interrogation room, the video of her passport being mutilated was already spreading like wildfire on social media. Passengers who had witnessed the incident began voicing their outrage, questioning the officer's actions. "She's a diplomat. They had no right." One man shouted. "This is blatant racism," another passenger declared, his words echoing through the terminal. Back in the room, Alice stared at the blank wall, her anger simmering beneath her composed exterior. She had faced prejudice before, but this was a new level of humiliation. She was a representative of justice and equality, yet here she was, detained and silenced. The door opened, and a young officer entered, his demeanor less confrontational than his colleagues. "Ma'am," he began hesitantly, "we're waiting for confirmation of your identity. It's just standard procedure." Alice met his gaze with steely resolve. Standard procedure does not involve destroying a diplomatic passport or detaining someone without evidence. What's happening here is anything but standard. The officer shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her piercing stare. "We'll sort this out," he mumbled before exiting. Hours passed, each minute stretching endlessly. The murmurs outside grew louder, and Alice could hear chants of "Justice for Alice" echoing faintly through the walls. Despite her situation, a small spark of hope ignited within her. People were speaking up. The world was watching. Just as she began strategizing her next move, the door swung open again. This time, it wasn't an officer but a journalist wielding a microphone and a camera. "Miss Johnson," the reporter said breathlessly, "the world is demanding answers. Do you have anything to say about what's happened?" Alice straightened her back, her professional demeanor unbroken. She looked directly into the camera, her voice calm yet powerful. "I am Alice Johnson, a UN diplomat. What you've witnessed today is not just an attack on me, but an attack on justice and equality. This is the reality many face every day. I demand accountability." Before the reporter could ask another question, airport security rushed in, attempting to usher him out. But the footage was already live, and the truth had begun to unravel. Outside, the terminal was now a scene of organized chaos. Protesters had gathered, and a crowd of passengers had grown bolder in their demands. Reporters from major news outlets flooded the area, their cameras capturing every angle of the escalating situation. Back in the room, Alice felt a sense of resolve. This moment, as humiliating as it was, could spark a broader conversation, a call to action. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for every individual who had been silenced, mistreated, or marginalized. And she wasn't backing down. The storm builds. Alice sat in the small, windowless interrogation room, her hands resting calmly on the table before her. On the surface, she appeared composed, but inside, a storm of emotions brewed. She replayed the events at the passport control desk in her mind, the scornful look on the officer's face, the audible gasps of the crowd as he mutilated her passport, the cold order to step aside. Her fingers twitched instinctively toward her phone, but it was gone, sealed away in a plastic evidence bag alongside her personal belongings. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. The humiliation she had endured was undeniable, but she knew that succumbing to anger would do her no good now. She had to remain sharp and deliberate. This was not just about her dignity. It was about the principle of justice she had sworn to uphold. Meanwhile, outside the room, chaos unfolded. The video of the passport-cutting incident had gone viral. Within minutes of being uploaded, the footage had amassed thousands of views and retweets. Social media exploded with outrage. People from around the globe weighed in with comments condemning the blatant prejudice. Influencers, activists, and even celebrities added their voices to the growing chorus, demanding accountability. At the airport, the terminal had transformed into a battleground of public dissent. Passengers who had witnessed the incident rallied together, holding their phones high to record every move made by the airport authorities. Chants of "Justice for Alice" reverberated across the space, growing louder with every passing minute. Airport staff, overwhelmed by the escalating situation, struggled to maintain order. By now, several news outlets had picked up the story, running the headline, "Diplomat detained. Racism at International Airport." Journalists flooded the terminal, microphones in hand, pushing through the crowd in search of eyewitnesses. Inside the room, Alice was visited again, this time by a senior officer accompanied by two younger colleagues. The senior officer, a burly man with a weathered face, carried himself with an air of authority. He placed a file on the table and sat across from her, while the others stood by the door, their expressions unreadable. "Miss Johnson," he began, his voice gruff, "we've sent your documents for verification. Until we receive confirmation, you'll need to remain here." Alice met his gaze squarely. "You've already destroyed my diplomatic passport," she said, her tone calm but firm. "And now you're asking me to trust that your verification process will be fair. This entire situation is a gross violation of my rights." The officer leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "We're just doing our job." "Your job," Alice countered, "is to uphold the law and respect international protocols. I am a UN diplomat, and I am protected under the Vienna Convention. Your actions today have not only violated that agreement, but have also brought shame to this institution." Her words seemed to unsettle the younger officers, who exchanged nervous glances. The senior officer, however, remained stoic. "We'll see what the investigation reveals," he said curtly before standing to leave. As the hours dragged on, the tension outside the room continued to mount. Protesters had begun to gather outside the airport, holding signs that read, "End Systemic Racism" and "Justice Knows No Borders." The hashtag Justice for Alice had climbed to the top of global trending topics, and news anchors debated the implications of the incident on live television. Inside the UN headquarters, the situation had become a top priority. Alice's assistant, a sharp-witted young woman named Clara, had managed to alert senior officials about Alice's detention. A flurry of calls and emails ensued as the UN sought to pressure the host country to release her immediately. Diplomatic channels were activated, and the Secretary General himself was briefed on the matter. Back in the interrogation room, Alice's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening once more. This time, it was a young officer carrying a tray with a bottle of water and a sandwich. He placed it on the table without meeting her eyes. "I'm not hungry," Alice said, her voice cutting through the silence. "But thank you." The officer hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. I just wanted to say I'm sorry about what happened. I saw the video. I think it's wrong, what they did." Alice looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "Then do something about it," she said. "Speak up. Don't let this kind of injustice continue." The officer nodded, his face flushed, before quickly leaving the room. Meanwhile, outside the airport, the protests had reached a fever pitch. People from all walks of life, students, activists, and even off-duty airport workers, had joined the demonstration. The crowd chanted slogans, their voices echoing across the terminal. Police officers formed a line at the entrance, but their presence only seemed to fuel the protesters' resolve. Inside the terminal, the passengers who had witnessed the incident were interviewed by reporters. One woman, a middle-aged traveler with glasses, recounted the event with visible anger. "She did nothing wrong," she said. "That officer destroyed her passport in front of everyone. It was disgusting to watch." Another passenger, a young man with a backpack, added she identified herself as a diplomat, and they still treated her like a criminal. "This isn't just wrong, it's shameful." As the situation spiraled, the pressure on the airport authorities intensified. The viral video had caught the attention of international human rights organizations, who issued statements condemning the treatment of Alice Johnson. Political leaders from several countries weighed in, some calling for a formal investigation, while others demanded immediate reforms to immigration protocols. The airport's PR team scrambled to contain the damage, issuing a vague statement about protocols being reviewed and regrettable misunderstandings. But the public wasn't buying it. The calls for justice grew louder, and the spotlight on the airport's discriminatory practices burned brighter. In the midst of the chaos, Alice remained steadfast. She knew that this moment was bigger than her, that it was an opportunity to shine a light on the systemic bias that so many faced daily. Her voice, amplified by the global outcry, had the power to make a difference. When the door to the interrogation room opened again, this time it wasn't an officer. Two men in formal suits entered, their demeanor calm but authoritative. "Miss Johnson," one of them said, extending his hand, "we're from the consulate. You're coming with us." Relief washed over Alice, but she quickly masked it with a professional nod. As she rose to her feet, she turned to the officers who had detained her. "This isn't over," she said firmly. "Not for me, and not for the countless others who have been wronged." With the consulate representatives at her side, Alice walked out of the room, her head held high. The fight was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers as Alice emerged, a symbol of resilience and courage. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the chants of "Justice for Alice" grew louder. She paused briefly, looking out at the sea of faces, before stepping forward to address them. "This moment," she began, her voice steady, "is not just about me. It's about all of us, about standing up against injustice, no matter where it happens. Together, we can create a world where dignity and equality are not just ideals but realities. The crowd roared in approval, their voices a collective promise of solidarity. Alice knew the journey ahead would be long, but for the first time that day, she felt hope. A hope that change was not only possible but inevitable. The tipping point. The atmosphere outside the airport had reached a boiling point. What had started as murmurs of protest had grown into a full-scale demonstration. Protesters now filled the streets leading to the terminal, their placards raised high with messages such as "Justice knows no borders" and "Accountability for all." The media coverage had drawn people from across the city, uniting them in outrage over the treatment of Alice Johnson. The hashtag #JusticeForAlice continued to dominate social media, now accompanied by millions of comments, retweets, and calls to action. Videos of the incident had been edited, shared, and analyzed from every angle, with commentators emphasizing the systemic issues highlighted by Alice's ordeal. Influential public figures began to speak out, and calls for immigration reform started trending alongside her story. Inside the airport, Alice was being escorted through a service corridor by the consulate representatives. Their steps were measured but quick, their demeanor exuding calm authority. Alice followed, her shoulders squared, her mind racing. The sting of humiliation still lingered, but she channeled it into resolve. "Miss Johnson," one of the representatives said as they walked, his voice low, "we've contacted the highest levels of government. They're aware of the incident and are taking steps to address it. However, the media pressure has escalated things faster than expected. This is already an international scandal." Alice nodded but said nothing. She knew the situation was precarious. For all the support she had garnered, there would undoubtedly be those who sought to downplay or deflect responsibility. This was her chance to ensure the narrative remained focused on the broader issue, systemic prejudice. As they rounded a corner, they were met by a small group of airport officials. The senior officer who had cut Alice's passport stood at the forefront, flanked by two visibly nervous subordinates. His once confident demeanor had given way to thinly veiled panic. "Miss Johnson," he began, his voice strained, "on behalf of the airport, I want to extend our deepest apologies for the misunderstanding." Alice stopped and turned to face him. "A misunderstanding," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You destroyed my diplomatic passport, publicly humiliated me, and detained me unlawfully. That is far more than a misunderstanding." The officer swallowed hard, his face reddening. "We were following protocol, but—" "Protocol does not involve violating international law," Alice interjected, "nor does it involve cutting a passport without evidence or treating a diplomat with blatant disrespect. If you're here to offer excuses, I suggest you reconsider." The officer opened his mouth to respond but was interrupted by the sudden arrival of a journalist. The man, microphone in hand, approached quickly, flanked by a cameraman. "Miss Johnson," the journalist began, "can you comment on the growing public outrage regarding your treatment here today?" The consulate representatives moved to shield Alice, but she raised a hand, signaling them to step aside. She turned to the camera, her expression resolute. "What you have seen today is not an isolated incident," she said, her voice steady. "It is a reflection of the systemic bias that millions of people face daily. This is not just about me. It's about creating a world where dignity and respect are not dependent on the color of your skin, your nationality, or your status. This fight isn't over. It has just begun." The journalist tried to ask another question, but Alice's words had already sent a ripple of energy through the crowd. Outside, the chants of the protesters grew louder, their voices carrying her message far beyond the airport walls. In the hours that followed, the response from the international community was swift and decisive. The United Nations issued an official statement condemning the treatment of Alice Johnson and demanding a thorough investigation. Several world leaders added their voices to the chorus, calling for accountability and reform. The airport's management, now under intense scrutiny, scrambled to contain the damage. They issued a public apology, though it did little to quell the outrage. The officers involved in the incident were suspended pending an investigation, but many viewed the move as too little, too late. Meanwhile, the protests outside the airport showed no signs of abating. What had started as a local demonstration had grown into a global movement, with solidarity marches taking place in cities around the world. Social media became a hub of activism, with users organizing petitions, donation drives, and awareness campaigns under the banner of #JusticeForAlice. Alice, now back in the care of the consulate, was briefed on the unfolding events. She listened carefully, her mind already working on how best to leverage the momentum. This wasn't just about clearing her name or demanding an apology. It was about sparking lasting change. Miss Johnson, one of the representatives, said, "The UN has offered to arrange a press conference for you tomorrow. They believe it's important for you to address the public directly." Alice nodded. "I agree. But it won't just be about me. I want the focus to be on the systemic issues that led to this moment. This is bigger than one incident." The representatives exchanged approving glances. "Understood. We'll make the necessary arrangements." That evening, Alice sat in a quiet room, reviewing her notes for the press conference. She thought about the countless individuals who had reached out to share their stories of discrimination and injustice. Each message was a reminder of why she had entered diplomacy in the first place, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Clara, her assistant at the UN headquarters. "The world is watching, Alice. You've got this." Alice smiled faintly and typed back a simple response. "Thank you. Let's make it count." Outside, the streets remained alive with the energy of protest. Candlelight vigils had been organized in several cities, their flickering flames a symbol of hope and resilience. Activists shared stories, chanted slogans, and called for justice not just for Alice, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by systemic oppression. In the early hours of the morning, as Alice prepared to rest, she looked out the window at the distant glow of the city lights. The fight ahead would be long and arduous, but for the first time in days, she felt a sense of clarity. This moment was more than a turning point. It was the start of a movement, and she was ready to lead it. The press conference, a moment of reckoning. The day of the press conference arrived, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Cameras from every major news outlet lined the packed conference hall, their lenses trained on the podium where Alice Johnson was set to speak. Protesters gathered outside the venue, holding signs and chanting slogans that had become the rallying cry of a global movement. Justice for Alice and dignity without borders. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Diplomats, journalists, activists, and members of the public filled every seat, while countless others tuned in online to watch the live broadcast. Alice's story had transcended her personal ordeal. It had become a symbol of resistance against systemic injustice. Alice stood backstage, her mind focused despite the cacophony of activity around her. A consulate representative approached her, holding a clipboard. "Miss Johnson, everything is set. You'll speak for 15 minutes, followed by a brief cue and a session." Alice nodded. "Thank you. Let's get started." As she stepped onto the stage, a wave of applause greeted her. The sound was deafening, a collective outpouring of support and solidarity. Alice paused at the podium, taking a moment to absorb the energy in the room. She adjusted the microphone and began to speak. "Good morning, and thank you all for being here today," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "My name is Alice Johnson, and I stand before you not just as a diplomat, but as a representative of those who have been silenced, marginalized, and dismissed for far too long." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on her. Cameras zoomed in, capturing her expression of calm determination. "What happened to me at the airport was not an isolated incident," Alice continued. "It was a symptom of a much larger issue, a system that too often discriminates against those it is meant to serve. I was fortunate to have the support of so many, but what about those who do not? What about the individuals who face similar injustices every day, yet their stories go untold? Her words struck a chord, resonating with the audience and those watching around the world. On social media, the live stream garnered millions of views, with users flooding the comments section with messages of support and calls for action. Alice went on to detail the events at the airport, describing the humiliation she had endured and the systemic bias it revealed. But she didn't stop there. She shifted the focus to the broader issue, calling for comprehensive reforms to immigration protocols and accountability for those in positions of power. Systemic bias is not just an individual failing, she said. It is a structural issue that requires structural solutions. We must implement policies that prioritize fairness and transparency. We must educate those in authority to recognize and eliminate their biases, and we must hold institutions accountable when they fail to uphold the principles of justice and equality. As Alice spoke, the crowd hung on her every word. Her passion and conviction were undeniable, and her ability to connect her personal experience to a global movement was nothing short of inspiring. The Q&A session that followed was equally impactful. Journalists asked tough questions, and Alice answered them with clarity and grace. "Miss Johnson," one reporter began, "what do you hope to achieve from this movement?" Alice took a moment before responding. "Change," she said simply. "Not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been treated unfairly because of their identity. This is about dismantling systems that perpetuate inequality and building a world where dignity is a right, not a privilege." Another journalist asked about the immediate steps she wanted to see. "I want a full investigation into the events at the airport." Alice replied, "I want those responsible to be held accountable, and I want reforms to ensure this never happens again. But more importantly, I want this moment to spark a broader conversation about systemic injustice and what we can do to address it." Her responses were met with applause, and the momentum of the movement continued to grow. Outside the press conference, the protests had evolved into a celebration of solidarity. Activists handed out pamphlets, musicians performed songs of resistance, and speakers took to makeshift stages to share their stories. The energy was contagious, a powerful reminder of the strength that came from unity. As Alice exited the venue, she was met by a crowd of supporters. They cheered and applauded, many holding up signs that read, "We stand with Alice." She paused to address them, her voice amplified by a portable microphone. "This moment belongs to all of us," she said. "Together, we are stronger. Together, we can create the change we want to see. Thank you for standing with me, not just today, but every day." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the streets. Later that evening, Alice returned to her temporary accommodations, exhausted but invigorated. She sat at her desk, reviewing messages from supporters and planning her next steps. The press conference had been a success, but she knew the fight was far from over. Her assistant Clara called to provide updates. "Alice, the press conference has already made waves. Several governments have issued statements of support, and the UN is planning to launch an international task force on systemic bias in immigration practices." "That's good news," Alice said, though her tone remained measured. "But we need to keep the pressure on. This can't just be another moment that fades into obscurity. It has to lead to lasting change." Clara agreed. "I'll coordinate with the task force and make sure your recommendations are included. Also, several NGOs have reached out. They want to collaborate on campaigns inspired by your story." Alice smiled faintly. "Then let's get to work." That night, as she prepared for bed, Alice took a moment to reflect. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions: anger, humiliation, determination, and hope. But through it all, she had remained true to her purpose. This wasn't just about her. It was about creating a better future for everyone. As she drifted off to sleep, her thoughts turned to the people who had stood by her: the protesters, the activists, the journalists, and the countless others who had lent their voices to the cause. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with, and Alice knew that their work was only just beginning. The world responds. The ripple effect of Alice Johnson's press conference reverberated across the globe. What had begun as an isolated incident at an airport had now evolved into an international conversation on systemic bias, accountability, and human dignity. The sheer scale of public reaction was unprecedented, with movements inspired by Alice's story springing up in cities around the world. The streets of New York, London, Nairobi, Tokyo, and Rio de Janeiro were filled with marches and rallies, their participants carrying banners that bore Alice's words, "Dignity is a right, not a privilege." News stations broadcast images of diverse crowds standing shoulder to shoulder, unified by a shared demand for justice. Social media platforms continued to amplify the message, with the hashtag #JusticeForAlice now synonymous with a broader call for equality. In Geneva, the United Nations Human Rights Council convened an emergency session to discuss the global implications of Alice's case. Diplomats from member states, human rights activists, and legal experts gathered in a grand hall, their conversations charged with urgency. The Secretary General himself took the floor, addressing the assembly with uncharacteristic fervor. "The incident involving Ms. Alice Johnson is not an anomaly," he began, his voice echoing in the chamber. "It is a reflection of the systemic challenges we face as a global community. This is a wake-up call, a reminder that our work is far from complete." The session culminated in the announcement of an international task force dedicated to combating systemic bias in immigration and border control practices. Alice was invited to serve as a special advisor, a role she accepted with humility and determination. "This is an opportunity to make real, lasting change," she said during the session, "and I intend to see it through." Meanwhile, in the country where the incident had occurred, the government faced mounting pressure. Calls for an official investigation grew louder, with opposition leaders and civil society organizations demanding transparency and accountability. The Ministry of Justice announced the formation of a commission to investigate not only Alice's case, but also the broader practices of the country's immigration and law enforcement agencies. The officers directly involved in Alice's detention were placed on administrative leave, and the airport's senior management faced public scrutiny. The senior officer who had mutilated Alice's passport issued a public statement, though his words did little to quell the outrage. "I was following established procedures," he said. "If mistakes were made, I deeply regret them." His statement was met with widespread criticism. Commentators pointed out that the actions taken against Alice went far beyond procedural errors. They were a glaring example of systemic prejudice. Calls for his resignation flooded social media, accompanied by demands for structural reforms. Back in New York, Alice worked tirelessly to keep the momentum of the movement alive. Her office at the UN became a hub of activity, with meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions filling her days. Activists and organizations from around the world reached out, eager to collaborate on initiatives inspired by her story. One of the first projects to take shape was the Global Dignity Initiative, a campaign aimed at raising awareness about systemic bias and advocating for policy reforms. The initiative included educational programs, workshops for law enforcement and immigration officials, and advocacy efforts at the national and international levels. Alice threw herself into the work, knowing that the window of opportunity was small. "This isn't just about addressing what happened to me," she told her team during a meeting. "It's about preventing it from happening to anyone else." As the weeks passed, Alice's story continued to dominate headlines. Documentaries and in-depth investigative reports explored the broader issues her case had highlighted. One particularly impactful piece aired on a major news network, featuring interviews with individuals who had experienced similar injustices. Their stories, combined with Alice's powerful commentary, painted a vivid picture of the systemic changes that were urgently needed. Public pressure led to tangible outcomes. In the country where Alice had been detained, the Commission of Inquiry released a damning report detailing widespread issues within the immigration system. The report included recommendations for comprehensive reforms, many of which were directly influenced by Alice's advocacy. The government announced plans to implement these changes, including mandatory anti-bias training for immigration officers and the establishment of an independent oversight body. Despite the progress, Alice faced challenges on multiple fronts. Not everyone welcomed the changes her case had inspired. Conservative commentators accused her of overreacting, and some officials resisted the proposed reforms, claiming they were unnecessary or impractical. Alice received hate mail and threats, reminders of the resistance that often accompanied meaningful change. But she refused to be deterred. The fact that people are fighting against this change only proves how deeply rooted the problem is, she said during an interview, and it makes me even more determined to see this through. Her resilience inspired countless others. Activists around the world took heart from her courage, using her story as a rallying point for their own efforts. In some countries, grassroots movements successfully lobbied for changes to immigration policies, citing Alice's case as a turning point. One evening, after a particularly long day, Alice sat alone in her office, reviewing a draft of a speech she was scheduled to deliver at the upcoming UN General Assembly. Her thoughts drifted to the countless individuals who had reached out to her, sharing their stories of injustice and resilience. She thought about the protesters who had stood outside the airport, the journalists who had risked their jobs to cover her story, and the activists who had carried her message across borders. She glanced at a framed photograph on her desk, taken at one of the rallies. In the picture, a young girl held a sign that read, "Alice, you give us hope." The memory brought a smile to her face. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but moments like these reminded her of why she had chosen this path. Alice turned back to her speech, her resolve stronger than ever. The world was watching, and she was determined to make every moment count. This wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a fight for the future, and she was ready to lead it. Alice leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples as fatigue threatened to take over. The weight of responsibility pressed on her, but so did the urgency of the moment. She had become a symbol for millions, and while it was gratifying to see the world respond so powerfully to her story, it was also a reminder of the immense work that lay ahead. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. Clara, her assistant, stepped in, a stack of documents in her arms, and a determined look on her face. "I know it's late," Clara said, placing the papers on Alice's desk, "but we've received an official draft of the UN Task Force's preliminary recommendations. They want your input before the final version is presented at the General Assembly." Alice sighed, but her expression softened. "You're relentless, Clara," she said with a faint smile. "Not as relentless as you," Clara shot back, pulling up a chair. "Besides, this is important. They're proposing some significant changes, real changes." Alice nodded, flipping through the pages. The recommendations were thorough, addressing systemic bias in immigration practices, accountability mechanisms, and mandatory cultural competency training for border officials. A section on protecting whistleblowers within immigration agencies stood out to her, a clear sign that the movement had begun to tackle the roots of the problem. "This is good," Alice said after a moment, her voice thoughtful. "But it's not enough. We need stronger language on enforcement mechanisms. Recommendations are meaningless without the means to implement and monitor them." Clara scribbled notes as Alice spoke, her pen flying across the page. "I'll make sure that's included," Clara said. "Also, there's something else you should see." She handed Alice a tablet, its screen displaying a video from a rally in Johannesburg. In the footage, a young man stood on a makeshift stage, addressing a crowd with fiery passion. "What happened to Alice Johnson was wrong," he said, his voice echoing through the crowd. "But what's worse is that it could happen to any of us. This fight is not just hers, it's ours. And we will not stop until justice is more than a word. It must become a reality." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices filled with determination. Alice watched the video in silence, her eyes glistening with emotion. She felt the impact of her story in a way that no press conference or news headline could convey. Real people, in real places, were rising up, not just for her, but for themselves, their families, and their communities. "They're counting on us, Clara," Alice said softly, setting the tablet aside. "We can't let them down." The next day, Alice attended a strategy meeting with representatives from several human rights organizations. The room buzzed with energy as they discussed plans for the upcoming Global Dignity Summit, an event inspired by Alice's ordeal. Leaders from dozens of countries were expected to attend, and the summit promised to be a platform for transformative dialogue. Alice listened intently as each representative shared their ideas. Some focused on policy reforms, while others emphasized the importance of grassroots activism. When it was her turn to speak, Alice stood, her presence commanding attention. "This summit is an opportunity to do more than talk," she began. "It's a chance to set a global standard for dignity and respect. But we need to ensure that the voices of those most affected are front and center. This can't just be about diplomats and policymakers. It has to be about the people." The room erupted in applause, and the discussion shifted to actionable steps. Plans for workshops, panel discussions, and community engagement initiatives began to take shape, all aimed at creating tangible change. Later that evening, as Alice prepared for a live interview on a major news network, she received a call from an unexpected source: the Secretary General of the United Nations. "Miss Johnson," he said, his tone warm but serious, "I wanted to personally thank you for the work you've done. Your courage has inspired not just individuals, but institutions to reflect and act." "Thank you, Mr. Secretary General," Alice replied. "But there's still so much to be done." "I agree," he said. "That's why I'd like to formally extend an invitation for you to deliver the keynote address at the General Assembly next month. The world needs to hear your voice." Alice was momentarily speechless. The General Assembly was one of the most prominent platforms in the world. A chance to address leaders, influencers, and citizens from every corner of the globe. "I would be honored," she said finally, her voice steady. "Good," he said, "because this is just the beginning. Together, we can turn this moment into a movement." That night, Alice stood in front of the camera, the bright lights of the studio shining on her as the anchor introduced her. "Alice Johnson," the anchor began, "you've become a symbol of resilience and change. How does it feel to know that your story has sparked a global movement?" Alice paused, choosing her words carefully. "It's humbling," she said, "but it's also a reminder of how much work we have to do. This isn't about me. It's about the millions of people who face systemic injustice every day. My story is just one among many, and my goal is to ensure that no one else has to endure what I did." The interview continued, covering everything from her plans for the General Assembly to her thoughts on the role of social media in modern activism. Throughout, Alice's message was clear: this was a fight for everyone, and it was far from over. When the interview ended, Alice returned to her office, where a stack of letters awaited her. Among them was a handwritten note from a young girl in India. "Dear Miss Johnson," it read, "you are my hero. I want to be brave like you when I grow up. Thank you for showing us that we can make a difference." Alice smiled as she read the note, her heart swelling with determination. The fight was far from over, but moments like these reminded her why she continued to push forward. This wasn't just about justice for Alice, it was about justice for everyone. And she wasn't stopping until the world changed for the better. The summit and the shift. The Global Dignity Summit was unlike any event Alice Johnson had ever attended. Hosted at the UN headquarters in New York, the gathering brought together world leaders, activists, policymakers, and community organizers. The air was electric with anticipation as attendees filed into the Grand Assembly Hall, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The summit was a direct result of Alice's ordeal, a testament to the power of a single moment to ignite a global movement. Banners with the words "Dignity Without Borders" adorned the walls, and the hashtag Justice for All trended globally as the event was live-streamed to millions. The summit's opening day was packed with panel discussions and breakout sessions, each addressing different facets of systemic injustice, from immigration bias and racial profiling to gender inequality and economic disparity. At the heart of it all was Alice. As the keynote speaker, she was the undeniable star of the summit. But she didn't see herself as a star. She saw herself as a bridge, connecting the voices of those often silenced to the halls of power where real change could be enacted. The keynote address. When Alice stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Cameras zoomed in on her as she approached the podium, her figure framed by the iconic UN emblem. She took a moment to gather herself, her gaze sweeping over the sea of faces before her. Then she began. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "Today, we gather not just to discuss the challenges we face, but to confront them head-on. This summit is more than a meeting. It is a declaration that dignity is a universal right, not a privilege to be granted or withheld based on someone's appearance, nationality, or status." Her words echoed through the hall, punctuated by the flash of cameras and the quiet hum of translators working to carry her message across languages. A few months ago, I stood in an airport interrogation room, humiliated and stripped of my dignity. But in that moment, I realized something. My experience, painful as it was, is not unique. It is a reflection of the systemic biases embedded in institutions around the world. Alice paused, letting her words sink in. She glanced at her notes, but quickly set them aside. This was a moment for sincerity, not scripts. "I speak to you today not as a victim, but as a survivor. And I carry with me the stories of countless others who have faced injustice, stories of resilience, courage, and hope. It is for them, and for future generations, that we must act." Her voice grew stronger as she outlined her vision for change. She called for comprehensive reforms to immigration systems, the establishment of independent oversight bodies, and the inclusion of marginalized communities in decision-making processes. She emphasized the importance of education, urging institutions to implement mandatory anti-bias training and to foster environments of empathy and understanding. But she didn't stop at policy. Alice spoke about the need for cultural shifts, about dismantling the stereotypes and prejudices that have become ingrained in societies over generations. "We must challenge ourselves," she said, "to unlearn the biases we've been taught and to build systems that reflect the best of humanity. This is not just a fight for justice, it is a fight for our collective soul." When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Delegates rose to their feet, their clapping thunderous and sustained. Tears glistened in the eyes of many, moved not just by Alice's words, but by the profound truth behind them. The ripple effect. Alice's speech marked the turning point of the summit. Over the following days, agreements were drafted, alliances formed, and resolutions passed. Nations pledged to reform their immigration systems, and several announced immediate measures to address systemic bias. The summit culminated in the signing of the Global Dignity Charter, a landmark agreement that sets standards for fair treatment and accountability in international institutions. The charter included key provisions inspired by Alice's advocacy, mandatory training programs, independent review boards, and protections for whistleblowers. It also established the Dignity Fund, a financial resource dedicated to supporting individuals and communities affected by systemic injustice. Alice was invited to co-chair the newly formed Global Dignity Council, a position she accepted with humility. "This is just the beginning," she said during the council's first meeting. "Our success will be measured not by words, but by actions." The personal toll. Despite the summit's success, the journey had taken its toll on Alice. The endless meetings, interviews, and speeches left her physically and emotionally drained. She often found herself replaying the events of the airport incident in her mind, grappling with the lingering trauma. But she refused to let it consume her. Instead, she turned to the very movement she had helped create, finding strength in the stories of others. One evening, she received a letter from a young woman in South Africa who had been detained at a border crossing under similar circumstances. "Your story gave me the courage to speak up," the letter read. "Thank you for being our voice." Alice folded the letter carefully, placing it in a drawer alongside dozens of others. Each message was a reminder of why she continued to fight, even when the weight of the world seemed unbearable. The path forward. As the months passed, the changes sparked by Alice's story began to take shape. New policies were implemented, and immigration officers around the world underwent training programs designed to address bias and promote cultural sensitivity. The independent oversight bodies established by the Global Dignity Charter uncovered systemic abuses in several countries, leading to reforms and, in some cases, prosecutions. The airport where Alice had been detained became a symbol of transformation. Its senior management was replaced, and the facility became the first to adopt the Charter's principles in full. When Alice returned to the airport months later, she was greeted with flowers and applause by staff and passengers alike, a powerful gesture of reconciliation. But Alice knew the fight was far from over. Systemic change was a slow and often grueling process, and there would always be those who resisted progress. Yet she remained undeterred, her resolve only growing stronger with each victory. A legacy of hope. 1 year after the summit, Alice stood in front of a classroom filled with young activists. She had been invited to speak at a workshop organized by the Global Dignity Council, and as she looked at the eager faces before her, she felt a surge of hope. "You are the future," she said, her voice steady and warm. "The fight for justice doesn't end with me. It continues with you. Remember that every voice matters, and every action counts. Together, we can build a world where dignity truly knows no borders." The room erupted into applause, and Alice felt a familiar sense of purpose. Her journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it had also been profoundly rewarding. She had turned her pain into power, her humiliation into hope, and in doing so, she had not only changed the world, she had inspired others to do the same. As she left the classroom that day, Alice looked up at the sky, her heart filled with gratitude. The road ahead was still long, but she was no longer walking it alone. Together with millions of others, she was paving the way for a brighter, more just future. And that, she knew, was the greatest victory of all.